Hello and welcome back to Dukascopy TV. Now, many of you paying attention to worldwide events will have noticed the resurgence of violence in Iraq. The latest al-Qaeda affiliated group is called ICIS or ICIL, and it's a well-funded and organised group currently sweeping through towns and cities in the country. As it stands now, the militant group are around 40 miles from Baghdad, with the capital city only days away from a possible attack. Naturally, this will affect investment in the country and considerably slow Iraq's economy once again. But by how much, and do the markets really care? What are the real financial risks here? Well, joining me on the line is John Drake, an Iraq specialist and a risk assessment maker for potential investors in Iraq. John, I'm sure you wish you didn't have to hear the words renewed insurgent violence, but what is actually happening and what are you telling investors?
Well, at the moment, with the militants sweeping down through parts of the north and central region, the best thing would be for organizations which have a large investment in the country is to review their safety measures, their security procedures, and unfortunately also their contingency plans and evacuation measures. If your operations are in somewhere that's quite close to the front line, you should be looking at whether or not you need your non-essential staff to be there. Do you need people to be operating administrative duties at the operations if they can do it from outside of the country, for example? It's going to be easier to get people out of the country now than it will be if the situation deteriorates and maybe access to the airport becomes more dangerous or flights become booked up or certain areas become too hazardous to send your staff. It would be easier to get people out now if you think you could carry on working without them.
Obviously, one of the questions is how the US and UK is going to react to this. We know the Foreign Secretary, William Hague, has said Britain won't get involved, and it's the last thing the Obama administration needs. But they are putting some forces down, aren't they, to protect embassies. Is that improving stability and a sense of security at all?
The additional forces will be able to help provide logistical support and advice and assistance if required in places like the international zone in Baghdad. There's very little the militaries of the two countries can do without altering the state of play on the ground. Regardless of what happens over the next few months, certain people are going to have their reputations damaged. It's going to be a potential political minefield depending on what action, what policies different governments adopt on the issue. It's going to be very politically difficult, both in Iraq and in Western countries if they try to become more militarily involved in the situation. There's also the potential for regional diplomatic fallout depending on which players are involved, such as Iran to the east of Iraq. It depends on what partnerships are formed and who's involved in the process. There's only so much that the military forces of the Western countries can do before they might overstep the mark or complicate the situation on the ground. So it's a very delicate situation. It's a potential minefield.
Now, interestingly, the markets haven't really reacted to all this. Crude oil, for instance, is nowhere near the highs we saw in 2013. Should investors and other market players be more cautious here? I mean, isn't there a danger of underestimating this new wave of violence?
At the moment, the majority of the oil operations are in the south of the country, around Basra and certain fields around there. Fortunately, this is quite far from the current battle lines. Now, the militants have managed to gain a lot of ground very quickly over the last week, but that was in majority or predominantly Sunni parts of the country, where there is a degree of support from the local population and a notable lack of support for the predominantly Shia security forces in these areas. So it's been a series of quick wins for the militant organization, which has made it seem like they're very powerful, very efficient, and very fast at gaining ground. They're going to struggle to take more ground around the more mixed parts of the central region, and they will definitely find it difficult to get into the predominantly Shia parts of the country further south. So it will be very difficult for them to get down anywhere near where the oil activities are taking place. That said, this organization will want to maintain pressure on the Iraqi authorities, and the most important and critical aspect of the Iraqi government's revenue streams obviously comes from the energy sector. So any group that wants to harm the Iraqi government will be intent on targeting energy infrastructure simply because it is so important to government revenue streams. So as much as the oil activity is far from the current fighting, I would advise anyone in the energy sector to review their measures and just be aware that this could result in a higher risk of maybe terrorist attacks in the south, for example.
Finally, John, I know it's hard to tell what the next move could be by the West, but in the meantime, can you give us some examples of how investment has improved in Iraq and the capital, Baghdad, and would you say it's better than 10 years ago?
I would say one concern is that the US military has a much less presence now than it did have 10 years ago. Obviously, after the invasion, there were thousands of troops there. And without that provider of support now, conditions are more vulnerable to deterioration in conditions. That said, there is more of a semblance of a state. There's more establishment of foreign investment and industry in certain parts of the country. There's also still optimism over the Kurdish regional government territory in the north, and especially around Kirkuk, seeing as the Kurdish security forces have seized parts of the city to protect it from the advance of the militants. This is another area with a lot of oil and gas reserves, and the fact that it's now under the protection of a security force which has managed to rebuff many terrorist attacks over the last 10 years can come as some reassurance. I won't say that KRG territory is going to remain immune to the violence. The security forces are very adept up there at keeping out the militants, but if the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant manages to establish some kind of a consolidated area of activities right on the border of KRG territory, they will try and launch attacks against it, which will pose a concern for the investors who have flocked to the relatively stable part of Iraq over the last few years. So I would say there's still optimism up there, although it's not a risk-free environment, and there's still optimism in the far south of the country, even though there's going to be a likely rise in things like Shia militancy and uncertainty over the coming months.
OK, don't forget to keep an eye on Dukascopy TV for the latest information and analysis as the story develops. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.